Good evening. If I can have you take your seat, that would be great. Welcome, everyone. My name is Jennifer Geronima. I'm the President and CEO of the Legacy Center for Community Success. Before we talk about really why we're here tonight, I'd like to recognize two groups of people that have been very instrumental in the prevention work we've been doing over the last several years. I think they're actually all in the hallway. But the first are Barb, can you grab those folks out there so they can be recognized, please? Just for a second. They don't like to be put on the spot. The first group are the members of the Community Alliance for Youth Success. Some of you may have known Millionaire Partnership for Broken Youth. We merged with them. It's been 2.5 years ago already. Time certainly flies. So a lot of these folks in the back of the room, if you're on the coalition or you're on the youth committee that supports the coalition, please do this so everybody can see who you are. The kids in the green shirts are the youth committee. So we just want to thank you guys for all the work you do to help us put these kinds of things on. We'll get a little bit more into that later. But the human brain continues to mature and develop well into the 20s, well into adulthood. A specific region of the brain called the amygdala is responsible for instinctual reactions, including fear and aggressive behavior. This region develops early. However, the frontal cortex, the area of the brain that controls reasoning and helps us think before we act, develops later. Adolescents differ from adults in the way they behave, solve problems, and make decisions. And most of you in this room are parents, but you know this for a fact. So we invited you here tonight to learn more about the impact of alcohol on the adolescent developing brain. Our goal this evening is to share information with you and hope you will start a conversation if you haven't already with your youth. And when I say youth, I'm talking kids in middle school and high school. There are kids that start early, and we want to get in front of that. And so that's why I have the parents of younger kids here. Joining us tonight via Skype is Dr. Aaron White. He's the Program Director for Underage and College Drinking Research at the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism. Dr. White oversees funded studies on college and underage drinking prevention. He earned his PhD in biological psychology from Miami University of Ohio, where he studied the brain mechanisms underlying alcohol-induced amnesia, LACs. He completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the psychiatry department at Duke University Medical Center and served as an assistant professor there until joining NIAAA in 2008. He's an accomplished speaker and author with experience presenting nationally, internationally, on topics related to alcohol and youth. And the first 20 folks who registered for this event received the book, so hopefully most of you were those people. Dr. White will speak for about 50 minutes, and then he'll answer questions. If you have a question, we did put note cards on your seats. Please write your questions on the note cards, and I will go back so that he can see me on the computer back there and ask you the questions. It's a little bit high-tech. So I don't know how long the questions will go, but please don't be afraid to ask any questions. Now please join me in welcoming Dr. Aaron White to the screen.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to thank Jennifer and Barb for all the effort they put into organizing this, and I'd really like to thank all of you in the audience. It's 6:30 at night. I know you have other things to do, homework, getting dinner ready, packing lunches for tomorrow, and all of that. So I'm very grateful for your time. I know that a webinar is not as warm and fuzzy as an in-person talk, and I would love to be there. It's just getting harder and harder to be able to travel, given the new rules regarding travel for government employees. So we figured this was better than nothing. So let me go ahead and jump in, and I'll try to make this as brief as I can and leave lots of time for questions. So what I want to talk to you about tonight with the next 40 minutes or so is research regarding both how the brain develops when we're young and also how to take advantage of what we're learning about the teenage brain to prevent alcohol and other drug use during the adolescent years and at the very least, shift it until a little bit later in life when the brain is finished. What I'm going to talk to you about tonight, none of it is intended to be a just say no sort of mantra. I'm not going to tell you alcohol and other drugs are always horrible. I just don't believe that they're healthy for developing adolescent brains, and I think the research really supports that. I'm also not going to tell you parents how to parent. I'll share with you some of what we're learning about that, but you've got your own parenting style, your own decisions to make. I've got adolescents of my own, and like you, I'm just trying to make the best choices I can for them. I do have a little bit of a cold, so excuse me as I cough and hack my way through this presentation. So, as you know, I think we're all aware that alcohol and other drug use tends to start during the teenage years if it's going to start for somebody at all. We also know that if it starts during the teenage years, the prognosis is much worse, meaning that if somebody waits until they get out of the teen years to start drinking or doing other drugs, the likelihood that they'll ever go on to develop a problem is much lower than if somebody starts experimenting earlier in life during the teenage years. And we're going to talk about the reasons for that, the way the brain is changing, and the fact that the brain is built during the teen years to simultaneously push away from adults and explore and take chances and learn as much as possible about those things that are experienced as a teen makes his or her way toward the door to find their own path in life. And so the learning capacity of the teen brain can either work for teens, but sometimes it can work against teens, as is the case with substance use. So we know that that's the case, but the question is, why does alcohol and other drug use tend to start during the teen years? What's happening in the brain that makes this reinforcing for a teen? Why do some teens like the experience of alcohol and other drugs? And what are the risks involved? If there were no risks involved, it wouldn't be a big deal. Turns out there are risks involved. So we'll explore what are some of the short-term and long-term risks involved with alcohol and other drug use. I'll mention marijuana, but I will focus primarily on alcohol here. And so what I'm going to do is, in a little bit, walk you through a typical evening. If you were to go out as an adult or a teen, in this case I'll use examples of teens. If a teen were to go drink alcohol, what happens in the brain while that teen is drinking that causes changes in behavior that put them at risk of harm? So we'll explore some of that. And then also, what can we do about it? How do we go about delaying the onset of use until the brain is largely finished developing for a teen? And I know this is a lot harder than it sounds. It's hard to get teens to do their homework or clean their room, let alone trying to make choices for them about alcohol and other drugs. But we'll explore some strategies. So I want to jump in. Let's talk about what's happening in the teen brain a little bit. I think it will help explain a great deal about teen behavior outside of the context of substance use, but it certainly helps explain why teens tend to explore and experiment with substances and what the harms can be. I like this quote. It's from the beginning of a National Geographic article from a few years ago about the developing teen brain, and I think it captures adolescence nicely. Teenage brains, beautiful brains, moody, impulsive, maddening. Why do teenagers act the way they do? Viewed through the eyes of evolution, their most exasperating traits may be the key to success as adults. And let me unpack that a little bit. Essentially, adolescence is the transition from being a dependent child to being a relatively independent adult. And so adolescence is the transition between those two places, those two stages of life. And it generally occurs around the second decade of life, certainly the teenage years. In reality, probably now in America, into the mid-20s. Because if your teen goes to college, your young adult child goes to college and you pay their way, technically they're not done with adolescence yet, because adolescence is the transition to autonomy. But basically the teenage years and into the mid-20s is when adolescence tends to occur. And so the way we're built as humans is to follow adults around, let them take care of us, and then at about the age of 9 or 10, when puberty kicks in for young males and females, as part of the domino effect of changes in the body that happen with puberty. So in addition to getting bigger and hairier and all of that, there are changes that get kicked off in the brain. And the brain changes then drive a lot of the behaviors that are typical during the teen years, and some of the ones that are very common and very frustrating for we parents. So the eye rolling, the moodiness, the fact that we could tell a teen, hey, do this, and they say, oh, I will, and then you turn around and it's still not done. This sort of scatteredness of adolescence, the bickering, for some parents, the I hate yous, all of those things, the boredom, the blondness, it's all part of this phase of life that is adolescence, because those rumblings help motivate a teen to start making their way to the door and get out there and create their own path in life and eventually become their own adults, where they can have their own kids and go through the same things we're going through with our teens today. And so if you had a 10-year-old, let's say, who loved to spend time with her mom and just loved to hang out with mom and go places where mom goes, if at 18 she still feels the same way, all she wants to do is be around her mom and help out in the kitchen and be at home and go to whatever it happens to be that mom is doing, then the process won't work. There's no transition to autonomy, and you end up with a young person who's going to live, might live at home with you forever. And so it's vital that our kids not like us as much and want to push away, so they'll go explore. Okay. Now, while that's happening, as we're exploring the world and learning about the world and learning how to fit in, so that we can one day function in the world with autonomy, our brains are built to learn as much as possible about the experiences that we have as we make that transition. One of the most important brain changes involved in learning is the experience of reinforcement or pleasure. If you go out in the world, let's say you go to dinner and you order food and it's disgusting, you probably aren't going to have a good experience and you're not going to go back to that restaurant. You've learned to avoid that restaurant. Let's say you go to a restaurant and the food is delicious and the service is great and it makes you feel good. You feel happy. You feel reinforced. The food is pleasurable. You're probably going to go back to that restaurant. The brain uses reward and punishment as means of shaping behavior. So, teenager goes out into the world, teenager meets a young girl or boy, likes them, gets positive feedback. That teen's going to want to spend more time around that person. They go out in the world, they meet somebody, that person's not nice, they don't want to spend time around that person. Now, imagine, if you will, a bored, blah teenager who stumbles across a drug. Let's just use alcohol, but it could be any other drug. Alcohol affects the brain in a way that it produces euphoria, it produces pleasure. Now, to the brain, that suggests to the brain that whatever you just did to get that pleasure was very important for your survival and you should repeat. So, as our teens are out exploring the world, taking chances, learning about the world, pushing away from us, certain things are going to produce more pleasure than others. The brain is automatically going to learn about those things that produce pleasure so that we can repeat. And so, again, as I mentioned earlier, the way the brain changes can work for our teens, it can also work against them. So we're going to look through some of these issues regarding adolescent development and behavior change, look at how they contribute to alcohol and other drug use, and then talk about what those drugs, including alcohol, do to the brain short and long term. Okay, now, I'm taking so long to get through these first couple slides, I think I'll have you out of here by about midnight. I'll speed up, I promise. We used to think that the brain didn't change at all after about the age of 10. And the reason is mainly that the technology didn't exist until recently to actually look in the brain and see how it's functioning and changing in a young person's head. Because if you look at the brain itself, just the size of the brain, it is about 90% of the adult size by the age of 7. So forever, researchers just thought, oh, these brains weigh about the same. Therefore, all the changes that are taking place in a young adolescent must be driven by hormones, not by brain changes, because the brain is pretty much done. Well, we now know that's not true. The brain is changing a lot in teenage years. And hormones do play important roles in guiding behavior during adolescence, but so do some of these great changes in the brain. Some of the most important changes we've learned about in the brains of teens happen in an area behind the forehead called the frontal lobes. And what the frontal lobes do is the frontal lobes allow us to, let me just tell you this. The frontal lobes allow us to do something that is truly miraculous when you think about it, but we do it all the time, so we don't think much of it. And that is, the frontal lobes let you sit in your chair where you're sitting now, for instance, and project yourself into the future and think about the future and think about what you want the future to look like and how you're going to get there. And the next thing you know, your frontal lobes have guided you toward the future. Let me give you an example. I ask you, what are you doing tonight? And you say, well, in the future, when I get home from this talk, I need to do laundry. I need to do some emails. Whatever it is you have to do, you're envisioning a future. And you leave this talk, and your frontal lobe will get you there, and you get the work done. And we just do it all the time. Now, it turns out, excuse me for 1 second. It turns out that the frontal lobes are changing a lot during the teenage years, and teens can find it fairly difficult at times to use their frontal lobes to do the things that the frontal lobes will later do for them when they're finished. One of the most important things the frontal lobes do, in addition to planning for the future and making choices, is to control urges. So, for instance, deep inside your brain, you might have an urge bubble up to eat a donut. But your frontal lobes have a plan for your future that involves losing weight and getting ready for summer. And so the urge comes up from within to eat the donut. And the frontal lobes then will say, no, that's not consistent with the plans for the future. So we're not going to eat the donut. So the frontal lobes rein in our urges to do things. In teenagers, that's harder for them to do. They have strong urges, as we'll see, and it's harder for them than it is for us to use the frontal lobes to control those urges. Those urges might be, they could be any number, and let's return to that in just one moment.
Excuse me, Aaron?
Yes.
If I could interrupt for just a second, are you advancing the slides? Because we're still looking at the first one.
Yeah, I'm advancing the slides. I'm on frontal lobe changes during adolescence.
Okay, because we're still on the first one. Give us a second. We'll do a process check here.
Sure.
Go ahead and undo the slideshow for right now, and because right now all we're seeing right now is your main screen.
Okay.
There now I
go.
see it.
Okay.
How about don't go into like the slideshow mode on there, just advance it on here, and then we'll be able to see it.
Like that?
Yep.
Okay.
There we go.
Good. Thank you.
So nobody saw this slide yet?
Nope.
Okay. Am I on?
You're on.
Okay. So this slide I think is important enough to keep up here to show you. I just talked about it, but you can see the area highlighted in yellow there. Those are the frontal lobes. And what happens in the frontal lobes is fascinating still to me. Here's what happens. The number of neurons or brain cells in the frontal lobes doesn't really change very much from birth. In fact, a lot of them die right after birth. But from birth to 10 or so, there's not much of a change in the number of brain cells in your frontal lobes. However, the cells you do have in your frontal lobes throughout childhood, from birth to 10, will branch out like crazy and form a gazillion connections with other neurons. What happens is the amount of brain tissue, gray matter, the tissue that's we use to think and process information and make choices, all the good stuff the brain does tends to be done by what we call gray matter. Gray matter goes up in your brain as you go from birth to 10. In other words, the amount of potential circuitry you have in your frontal lobes actually increases from birth to 10. Then at about the age of 11 for girls, 12 for boys, it's like a switch gets flipped, and now all that gray matter, those potential circuits, now get put on the chopping block, and those circuits then get molded over time from 10 to about 20. So gray matter or brain tissue goes up in the frontal lobes from birth to 10 and then down from about 10 to 20. What's happening there? Well, what's happening is gray matter is getting packed in so that during adolescence, as we make our way out into the world and have new experiences, we can mold and fine-tune and shape those circuits based on experience in order to give us the frontal lobes we're going to have once we're adults. Once you get out of the early 20s, those are the frontal lobes you have. Not really much opportunity for changing or molding those frontal lobes for the rest of your life. Yes, they will change a little, but most of the real molding happens during childhood and in adulthood. So you can already see it's critical we help our teens do everything they can to mold the healthiest frontal lobe tissue that they can during the teen years, because that's the tissue they're going to have once they enter adulthood. Alcohol and other drugs, we're now learning, can really alter the trajectory of how those brain circuits mold, so that when you leave adolescence, you may be stuck with circuits that are not functioning as optimal as they would have had you avoided alcohol and other drugs. And it's not just alcohol and other drugs, other things like video games, other sinkholes for time. We have to be careful to help our teens learn to minimize in order to ensure that their frontal lobes develop in healthy ways. Now, underneath the frontal lobes, as Jennifer mentioned, you have areas of the brain that drive us emotionally, and those are run in full strength in adolescence. In fact, the emotional drive areas really mature far more quickly than the frontal lobe areas do that control those drives. So when we're adolescents, we can have very strong emotional drives without the frontal lobe abilities to really think through the choices we are about to make. So we do a lot of hot decision making, a lot of emotionally driven decision making. Think Romeo and Juliet. The intensity of those emotions and the urgency of those decisions that are made. So anyway, so strong emotional drives during the teen years, gray matter, cortical areas that are still trying to figure out how to handle those strong drives. And so, I don't know about you, but my 14-year-old son, who's a great guy, can have, in a 3-hour period, he can go from mad to happy to anxious to bored to and all over the place and back again, because these emotions take him for a ride, and he's still learning how to use his frontal lobes to modulate that. Now, what this culminates in psychologically for our teens is what this slide shows you is along the bottom axis there, the flat one, the horizontal one is age. And what this graph shows you are changes in a few psychological processes during the late teenage years, from 14 to 22. And pay attention to the upside down U-shaped solid curve there with the arrow pointing to it that says sensation seeking increases in mid-teens. This is the period of life, the late teens, sort of 16, 17, 18, that's when our drive to explore and take chances really peaks, probably in life. Our drive to not just to take chances for no good reason, but to take chances in order to explore, test ourselves, impress other people, to really blossom as independent young people. And so it's not surprising that if you look at when alcohol and other drug use happens, it tends to happen during this period of time when our teens are really driven to seek sensations and take chances. This provides an important message about what we should be doing for our teens and helping them do for themselves during these late teen years. Find things that light you up and make you feel alive that don't involve drugs or drinking. It's very important, and I'll come back to the reason why that's so important in just a moment. Now, this is a little complicated, but let me just walk you through this. This is the same slide I just showed you with the inverted line there, but I put underneath there the percentages of 14 to 15-year-olds and 16 to 17-year-olds who drink alcohol. And what you see is that as you go from 14 to 15 up to 16 to 17, the percentage who drink alcohol more than doubles, as is the percentage of binge drinkers and heavy drinkers, more than doubles. As that sensation-seeking curve goes up towards its peak, levels of alcohol use and levels of other drugs, including marijuana use, go up too. So the changes happening in the brain really create a situation where we're more drawn to substances and more willing to take a chance with them. Now, the good news is here in the U.S., levels of drinking are going down, as are levels of other drug use by and large. But alcohol, for certain, levels have come down considerably. So what this slide shows you is that in the year 1991, about 54% of 12th graders drank alcohol in a given month. It's down to about 39%. 25% of 8th graders, 1 in 4 8th graders used to drink alcohol in a given month. We're down to about 10% now. Same thing when we look at binge drinking. We were at about 11% of 8th graders were binge drinkers in 1991, and it's down to about 5%, and it's down for really all adolescents. And by the way, I'll just point this out now. Our teens drink less than kids in Europe. That's not true that teens in Europe drink more than our teens. I'm sorry, drink less than our teens, so that if we just let everybody drink, put wine in people's baby bottles and stuff, they'll never go on to become heavy drinking teens. It's just not true. Our teens drink less than teens across Europe, with the exception of Turkey, which is largely Muslim. And our teens binge drink less and get drunk less than teens throughout Europe, yes, even in France. So it is not the case that, we need to adopt some sort of European model. For some reason, levels of alcohol use are coming down greatly among teens. And to this point, at this point, marijuana levels are still coming down too, although I think most of us expect that will turn a corner moving forward, given changes in the laws and cultural attitudes. So, despite the fact that alcohol use is coming down among teens, we still have a considerable number of young people drinking, and most importantly, we know that those young people who start drinking in 8th, 10th, 12th grade are at greater risk of developing alcohol use disorder down the road than teens who wait. So, my message is not a just say no, alcohol is bad, neo-prohibitionist. No. My message is we need to do everything we can to delay the onset of use, hopefully prevent it forever. But if we can just delay the onset of use, every day we do that and succeed, the odds go down that our kids will develop a problem with alcohol, that they'll get injured using alcohol when they're young, etc. So it's important that we recognize that this is a stage of life when our kids are at increased risk of experimenting, becoming hooked, and being injured or experiencing other problems. So the longer we can wait and delay that, the better. Okay, let's now take a little walk through what happens in the brain when a teenager drinks alcohol that makes it so dangerous. So let's go ahead and jump in. So what this slide shows you, I know it's a busy slide, but this slide shows you what happens when somebody drinks alcohol, just a drink or two, up to about, the one on the left shows you no alcohol, the one in the middle shows you about 2 drinks, and the one on the right shows you about 4 drinks. So at about 2 drinks, the effects of alcohol on the frontal lobe becomes apparent significantly, and so does the effects of alcohol on the ability to do simple tasks that need the frontal lobes. So it only takes about 2 drinks to disrupt the ability of the frontal lobes to control impulses. With teenagers, the frontal lobes are not done yet. So you add alcohol to these still fragile circuits in a teen, it's going to really increase the risk that they make bad choices. If you think a teenager has trouble controlling his or her urges while they're sober, all you have to do is add a couple drinks, and the whole thing can fall apart. And I'll come back to that in a moment when we talk about risk taking. In the long term, we know that teens who abuse alcohol, in other words, they get drunk fairly often, that's the best way I can put it, their frontal lobes take a hit in terms of structure and function. So the frontal lobes are smaller in teens who abuse alcohol than teens who don't. And I always get asked, well, is this permanent? Well, we don't know if it's permanent. The good news is it looks like the effects tend to improve if you stay sober. However, you have to remember, the teen brain is not like the adult brain. The adult brain is pretty much finished developing. So all you're going to do is alter how it functions and then hope that it comes back to normal if you're an adult. For a teen, you're altering the entire trajectory of brain development. So it may not be as easy as saying, well, as long as they stop, the brain will heal. Even if the brain heals, it's going to heal on a different course than it would have been on without the alcohol. And it pretty much is the case that the more a teen drinks, as the number of drinks per day go up, the performance on tests of attention and decision making and impulse control go down. So it's a dose dependent effect to some extent. More use, worse performance. And it's hard to see this on the square there on the far right, but that represents marijuana use. That the heavier, the more days per month a teen uses marijuana, the worse their performance on tasks. So there's a sort of dose dependence here. Now, in addition to affecting the frontal lobes, one of the things that alcohol does very nicely is, as Jennifer mentioned, the amygdala is involved in helping us be aware when we're in danger. And the teenage amygdala is actually more active regularly than the adult amygdala. In other words, we as adults tend to think that teens are fearless, and in fact they're not. They're actually in many ways more anxious than we are. That's reflected in brain function. It helps keep them vigilant and safe as they're out exploring and taking chances. Well, we adults don't like the amygdala very much because it reminds us what we should be worrying about and makes us feel anxious. So if you're an adult and you drink, you go home at the end of the day, you have your glass of wine, and you like it. If you like it, part of the reason is because it calms the amygdala. You're less concerned about these things that are worrying you. The same applies to teens. When a teen drinks alcohol, the amygdala is dampened, they're less worried, they're less afraid. So if you add that effect to the effect of alcohol in the frontal lobes, you end up with a brain that's, at that stage of life, built to take chances and explore and not make the best choices all the time anyway. The frontal lobes become suppressed, the amygdala becomes suppressed, you're not as aware when you're in danger, and you're not really able to act on those feelings as much anyway. It helps explain why alcohol, it helps explain why, first of all, injuries are the leading cause of death for teens, and alcohol is the leading contributor to those injury deaths because it makes it much easier to take risks and get injured. It also makes us less likely to recognize when we're in danger, when we're around people that might not be safe for us, when we're in places we should leave. Alcohol makes it harder for us to stay safe even if we want to, because it makes us hard to recognize when we're in danger. And that culminates in things like this. This is just a screen capture from a YouTube video. There's a bunch of these online. For some reason, young males often like to try to jump off of buildings into small swimming pools when they're drunk. And I think this reflects the effects of alcohol on the amygdala and the effects of alcohol on the frontal lobes. Okay, now, something else that alcohol does very potently, particularly in teens, is that it suppresses memory formation. And this is something I've probably studied more in my career than anything else, and that's alcohol blackouts. People go out and they drink, and particularly if they drink quickly, alcohol hits the brain hard, shuts off areas called an area called the hippocampus, which you have one on each side of your head, and it shuts down the ability to make memories. I can't show you a video clip, and I'm going to use this screen capture to illustrate my point. This is a video clip that would show a guy who's a businessman, clearly, wakes up still in his suit, goes to the bathroom, looks in the mirror, and realizes he's got piercings all over his ears, his nose, his nipples, and farther south. And it's actually a commercial for spring water, urging you not to, to drink spring water instead of alcohol because this guy, you could be like this guy. Clearly, went out, drank too much, took chances he normally wouldn't take, and didn't make memories for it. So when he wakes up, he realizes that in the midst of frontal lobe suppression, amygdala suppression, and hippocampus suppression, he made some bad choices. Excuse me. And believe it or not, this happens. There was a story in USA Today a few years back about a young college guy who had this huge hoop piercing through his lip, and he said, "I don't know how I got it, or if it hurt. I was in Cancun, and I got drunk, and I did it." These things can really happen, and they're not just piercings. It could be sex, including unprotected sex. It could be fights. It could be stealing. It could be anything that a person does when they're drunk and their frontal lobes and their amygdala are suppressed. It's kind of frightening. And by the way, these things happen a lot. Don't worry too much about these numbers. Let me just tell you the take-home message. Take-home message is about 1 in 10 high school age students and college-age students who drink alcohol in a 2-week period black out in a 2-week period. In other words, if you drank alcohol in the past 2 weeks and you're 18, there's about a 10% chance you had amnesia. Now, that's how common it is. Very, very common. And like with the frontal lobes, alcohol doesn't just suppress the teen frontal lobes for a little while. It seems that it can, in cases of heavy drinking, damage the hippocampus too. The hippocampus is smaller in teens who abuse alcohol. Now, finally, in terms of the brain effects, in addition to suppressing the frontal lobe, suppressing the amygdala, suppressing the hippocampus, alcohol activates the reward system. There is a set of structures deep in your brain that exists just so that your brain can pat you on the back with a feeling of reinforcement or pleasure if you do something that the brain thinks is good for you. So, for instance, you're thirsty, you drink water, you go, ah, that felt good. You're hungry, you eat, ah, that felt good. Procreation involves quite a bit of pleasure. The pleasure shapes behavior and makes a person want to repeat the behavior they engaged in that produced that pleasure. Well, all of the things that we call drugs, alcohol, nicotine, heroin, pain pills, marijuana to some extent, all of these drugs have only one thing in common, and that's that they all activate the reward pathway. That's what makes them drugs to us. Alcohol and heroin are nothing alike in any way, except they both activate the reward system and produce pleasure. So these things that we call drugs, because they produce euphoria, as a result of euphoria, trick the brain into focusing attention and learning, because the brain assumes that must have been very important for survival because it felt so good. So it tricks the brain. The drugs essentially trick the brain into learning about them and repeating the behavior that led to their use. Okay, so now we have a full picture here. For teenagers, they feel blah and bored and restless. If they measure the future in days, not years like we do, they're really focused on breaking away from us and exploring the world and making friends and socializing. And anything the brain does that produces pleasure, anything the person does that produces pleasure, the brain will focus on to learn about with an eye toward helping that individual survive in the world. Well, if they stumble across a substance like cocaine or alcohol, the brain gets tricked into thinking this was very important. In addition, for some drugs like alcohol, the amygdala is suppressed and reinforcement comes by way of reduced anxiety and fear. So alcohol is a drug that for many teens produces euphoria and reduces fear and anxiety, which makes it easier to undertake the tasks at hand, namely socializing and exploring. Hence my position that it's very, very important that we try to get our teens through adolescence, help them learn how to detect the more subtle pleasures that come with healthy behaviors, rather than getting a blast of pleasure from a drug, which can make it very hard for the brain to kind of sort out priorities here, because the drugs can seem like such an important and valuable choice at some primitive level in the brain. Basically, the brains of teenagers are built to be kind of flat, but then when you detect something that activates the reward system, to really light up, so that there can be no mistake this was important. Well, again, drugs can usurp that process and trick the young brain. Finally, let me just tell you, one of the risks that alcohol poses that's not entirely unique. Some drugs like heroin, pain medications can do this. Xanax and some of the benzodiazepine drugs like Xanax, there's some risk, like Valium, there's some risk with this. But with alcohol, there's a real risk that if somebody overdoes it, what I mean by overdoes it is reached a very high blood alcohol level, but particularly if they reach the high blood alcohol level quickly, they can shut down the areas of the brain at the base of the head and produce effects there that lead to death. So you can suppress these brainstem areas that control breathing, keeping the heart going. gagging to get something out of your airway, if you happen to be drowning. Um, and by shutting down those areas, you can just directly die. So you can injure yourself, etc., by the effects of alcohol imbalance in the frontal lobes, but the effects on the brainstem can literally kill you. And in fact, every year this happens, and it's becoming more and more concerning because the the way that teenagers tend to drink is exactly the wrong way to drink if you want to live. That is, teens tend to drink hard and fast. No, it's not because it's illegal, not necessarily. It's something about being young. People want to drink a lot quickly. And unfortunately, that can be bad news. If you're drinking spirits, for instance, and there's been a trend toward increased distilled spirits consumption, like vodka, rum, whiskey, that gets into the body awfully fast and can very quickly shut down these brainstem areas. If you drink on an empty stomach, as many young women tend to do, the alcohol gets in even quicker, the blood alcohol level goes up, and you can shut down these areas pretty quickly. So, for example, the slide you're seeing is from a news story about a young girl, 14-year-old, who died from drinking too much vodka at her own sleepover. It is possible, before you throw up, to drink enough that you get enough alcohol into the body that it can directly shut down the brainstem areas and kill you. Not a lot you can do about that. It's what happens if you drink that much. And once it's in the body, there's not much you can do to get it out. So, for instance, when I started at Duke in 1999, there was a young man named Raheem Bath who went out with his friends, drank a bunch, did a bunch of shots right before they left the bar, walked himself home, got ready for bed, climbed into bed. While he was sleeping, all that other extra alcohol got absorbed and shut down the brainstem a little bit. He threw up, he inhaled a little bit of vomit, and he woke up, and he lived. However, over about a week-long period, that vomit he inhaled infected his lungs, and he died. So we don't know how many people, young people, get alcohol poisoning. But we do know, what's interesting is that it seems like the number is going up, even though the number of teens who drink is coming down. So we think what's happening is those teens who do drink are going to greater extremes, even though the overall number of teens who drink has come down greatly. Last summer, I guess this was 2 summers ago, even before a concert started at Nassau Beach, or Jones Beach in Nassau County. Where is that? I don't know. Anyway, it's either New York or New Jersey, I can't remember. 26 teens had to go get treated for alcohol poisoning even before the concert started. And I published this paper a few years ago showing that if you look at 18 to 24-year-olds, there's been about a 70% increase in hospitalizations for alcohol overdoses from 1999 to 2008, a time when the number of teens who were drinking was coming down a lot. Okay, couple of tips. The most important thing I can tell you, parents, is that our teens listen to us even if they tell us they don't. They really do. And so, for instance, if you look at what are the best predictors, best correlates, what's associated with not drinking or doing drugs among teens, it turns out to be that they know you'd be upset with them. That they know you would be disappointed in them if they did it. If you haven't told your teen that, they can't know that. If they can't know that, it's not going to influence their behavior. I've already talked to my kids about alcohol. I've been doing it since they were about 5, and I've always told them that it's not that I don't want them to ever drink. It's that I expect them to take care of their brains and get through the teen years before they do. That these are their only brains they have, the only brains they're going to get. And if 100 years ago, the average life expectancy for an American was 45. So if you made it through your teen years, you'd only have about 20 years left before you died. So if you messed up your brain when you were a teen, not as big of a deal. These days we live until we're about 80, which means if you mess up your brain when you're a teen, you're going to have about 60 years left with that brain. Society will have 60 years left with you and your brain. So if we can just get teens through the teen years and learning how to feel good and feel comfortable in their own skin and find things that are rewarding in life without substances, then they may be able to spend the next 60 years drinking moderately without any trouble. So if we want our kids to have a healthy relationship with alcohol, it's better, in my opinion, to try to delay the onset of use rather than try to teach them how to drink. For reasons I'll share some data with you in just a moment. These are just some data. I'm going to make sure these slides are available to you somehow, but these are just data showing that, for instance, this is one I really like, but it's difficult to interpret. The rate of past month illicit drug use in 2013 was 7.3% for youths whose parents always or sometimes helped with homework, compared with 15% among youths whose parents seldom or never helped. So in addition to talking to teens about your expectations, another thing we know seems to be valuable is being involved in a teen's life, helping them with their homework, having dinner with them. These things just let them know that they are part of a family, and that you're keeping tabs on them, that you're involved in their lives. Having curfews at night. One powerful predictor of teens who drink and have unprotected sex and all kinds of risky behaviors is that they're allowed to stay out late at night, particularly on the weeknights. So having a curfew where they have to be in and be in bed, being involved in that way. Authoritative parenting at the end of the day is the key, it seems, and that is the balance. You're not too permissive, you're not too overbearing. It's a balance of this is my house and these are the rules and you're going to follow them, but at the same time I want you to know I'm proud of you for doing this and I'm going to reward you for doing that. So it's that balance there, being involved in their lives, but yet setting rules and expecting them to follow the rules. Also, be aware that if we ask the question, where do teens get their alcohol? Where do they drink? It is, but in large part, at home, either your home or somebody else's home. Teens don't often get alcohol by having adults buy it, although they do. Much more likely to just be drinking at your home. Get alcohol from you or somebody else and drink in that way. And so it's important, I believe, for parents to share with other parents what their policy is about that. I know of communities where schools have had, private schools have had parents who are interested sign a form saying, we commit to being a substance-free home. So if your teen's at my house, you know that your teen isn't going to, as far as I can control it, going to be drinking and doing other drugs. It's something to consider. There are people who think that the best approach is to teach teens how to drink, that the problem, for instance, at college is the teens who drink heavily, they were never taught how to drink. If they just knew how to drink, they wouldn't drink so much. Well, it turns out the teens who drink the most at college are also the teens that drank the most in high school. So among their college-bound peer group. So they take with them, many of them take with them behaviors that were learned before college. Also, we know from research in the U.S. and several other countries now that parents who let their teens drink at home, those teens are more likely to drink heavily outside the home, and they're more likely to develop an alcohol use disorder down the road. And I can chalk it up to this scene, I think, this scene from American Lampoon's Vacation, where Chevy Chase wrecks the family Woody station wagon into a sand dune, and while trying to figure out what to do, he grabs a beer, walks over to a sand dune, sits down with his son Rusty and says, Russ, when I was a kid, one of the most important moments I had was sharing a beer with my dad. So I want to share a beer with you. He opens up the beer and he takes a sip. He hands it to Rusty, and then Chevy Chase just kind of looks off in the distance, waxing philosophical about relationships between fathers and sons, etc. And by the time he turns back around and gets the beer back from Rusty, it's empty. Rusty had chugged the entire beer. And unfortunately, I think that's often what happens if we say to a kid, okay, look, you can drink at home, but that's it. I don't want you drinking outside the home. You can drink at home where it's safe and I can make sure you're doing it right. Unfortunately, the message many teens get from that is, oh, I'm allowed to drink. And it makes it easier for them to decide to drink outside the home. So let's tie this all together. The adolescent brain changes in ways that help drive us toward our peers and out of the house. This helps us make the transition to independence. but it can also increase the risk of alcohol use, other drug use, and related harms as we fumble around and try to find our way onto our own autonomous path. Short-term, alcohol disrupts the frontal lobes, which are involved in decision-making and impulse control, the hippocampus, which is involved in memory, and the amygdala, which is involved in fear and anxiety. It also can suppress brainstem vital reflexes, which can directly lead to death. And by the way, adding other drugs to the mix that also suppress this brainstem can make it very, very risky. For instance, it doesn't take as much alcohol to kill you if you're also taking pain medication, narcotic pain medication, like oxycodone, etc., because both of those drugs suppress the brainstem. Alcohol activates the reward system, which produces pleasure and reinforcement. And these effects can make alcohol feel fun while greatly increasing the risk of negative consequences, including injury and death. Remember, it produces pleasure, but it also reduces anxiety. That is a powerful set of reinforcers for a teen. Perfectly fine for an adult after a hard day of work, but it's more important for us, I think, to teach our kids how to navigate these stressors as teens without medicating. Long-term, alcohol can alter the trajectory of adolescent brain development and cause lingering cognitive deficits. We don't know if these are permanent. There's a good chance the brain will rebound and figure out how to do those things that it needs to do, but the brain may never be exactly the same because you're putting on a different path of development. The safest bet is to delay the onset of drinking until brain development is complete. Now, I'm not going to tell you age 21 is the perfect age. I don't have a strong opinion about that, but that's the age we have now, and it fits pretty well with brain development. So somewhere around there, I think, is the right time. And we can teach our teens how to be safer on alcohol by educating them, by modeling healthy behavior and explaining things to them. We don't necessarily have to let them expose their brains to it. Okay, and finally, NIAAA has a bunch of resources related to this topic. For you adults who are wondering about your own drinking, how healthy it is, or somebody else's, we have something called Rethinking Drinking, which if you go online and do a search for Rethinking Drinking, you'll find it. And it allows you to put in your drinking levels, and it will tell you lots of things about your body, your brain, your health, as it pertains to those drinking levels. And so, very useful tool, and there's quite a bit of information on the site about alcohol and young people. Okay, now, let me just tell you one last thing. Please make sure if you have a way to write this down, you can call me, email me, anything you'd like to do. Please contact me. I'm happy to answer any and all questions you have moving forward. I hope this worked out okay, and thank you for sitting in for this.
I want to thank you for all being good students this evening and listening intently with both ears, right, teachers? I know it's a little bit hard to hear, but when you use the Skype, it's a little bit muffled, and we did the best we could. We will get you copies of the slides as well. We're going to post this on our website, so if you want to watch it again, you can do that. But I don't know if there's anybody that has any questions, because there are cards in your chairs. We'd like to, get the questions answered if you have any. So raise your hand if you're going to ask a question. Okay, we got one in front. Awesome. So Aaron, give us a minute while you call out your questions.
Sure.
Oh, a whole bunch of questions. They're slowly coming out of the woodwork, Aaron. We're getting questions. Okay. Raise your hand if you have one. Got a good one coming, I think.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. Okay, let me see if I can make this. Okay. Do you have thoughts on specific treatment techniques for substance using teens? And then the other one is commonly used is motivational interviewing, which is future focused. Is that the best approach?
Yeah. Well, thanks for the question. I do have to tell you, treatment side is not my real strong suit. I'm better at just telling you about the problems and then letting other people fix them. But I will say that the techniques that seem, I have done some treatment research, and the techniques that seem to work best are those where you, with anybody, but teens in particular, I think, are places where you get them to have their own experience with dissonance, where you basically say, you get them to this is what MI is really all about. Talk about their lives, their futures, what is it that they want, what are they looking for, and then help them recognize ways in which the path they're on is not the one that leads to what they want. And those sorts of experiences are really powerful, I think, for teens in particular, because they're not really as amenable to taking our suggestions as we'd like them to. They do internalize them, but remember, we're adults, and so we're sort of viewed with some skepticism by nature. So anytime you can get a teen to have those insights on his or her own, I think that it's a powerful fulcrum for behavior change. I think that general statement is about the best I can do for you.
Okay, good.
So many treatment techniques, but yeah, I like that.
Okay. Do we know why the number of teens drinking is going down, and what is the best thing we can do to promote that trend? And then the second question is, how much does the fear of legal consequences play a role?
Sure. Well, the legal consequences piece. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it has some effect, but there have been studies over the decades showing that even the harshest punishments don't necessarily dissuade substance use, including alcohol use. Teens are sensitive to some of the same things that adults are: price and access. Teens are saying that access to alcohol has gone down, so it could very well be that parents have gotten better at talking with teens and educating them, but also keeping alcohol out of their grasp. Maybe establishments are doing a better job of carding. So for whatever reason, access has gone down a little bit, ease of access, and that is associated with use going down. We don't see any displacement. A lot of people speculated that the decrease in alcohol use would show up in an increase in the use of some other drug. Haven't seen that yet. It's probably something like what happened with cigarettes. Teens, as a culture, kind of decided that this is not really as cool anymore. And some of the most powerful ways to get teens to think that way is to point out when they're being manipulated by a company, and that's part of what happened with smoking. There was something called the Truth Campaign, where it was messages designed by youth for youth, pointing out that they're being lied to by the industry. That sort of messaging probably played a role with smoking, and it is probably playing a role with alcohol too. It would be nice to say that it's all the grassroots efforts in communities and all the work that my institute has done, and but we just don't know. It's probably 10 different things, but we're just happy. It's a real trend. It's got a lot of momentum, and we expect it'll keep moving in that direction.
Good. Okay.
Yeah.
Does adolescent exposure to R-rated movies contribute to early onset of adolescent drinking and other sensation-seeking behaviors?
Okay, I'm going to answer that. Let me add one statement. I forgot to answer part of the previous question. How do you promote that? I would say this is something we can point out to teens and say, guess what? Did you know the number of teens that drink has been cut in half in the last decade or two? And because they get caught up in the slipstream of the changes that are happening among their peers. And so if the same way it can work against them, if a teen thinks that everybody drinks, they're more likely to drink. One way to decrease drinking at college, for instance, is to point out to college students that they overestimate how many people drink. So I think pointing out that downward trend to teens is probably helpful. I don't think watching R-rated movies contributes directly as a whole to drinking. We still don't have strong evidence that alcohol advertising itself contributes to teen drinking. We suspect that's true. There are associations between how many ads teens see and how much they drink, but we don't know that it's causal. So I would say with R-rated movies in general, very unlikely that alone is going to do it. Yeah.
Okay. Why do you say that teenage years are most critical time to focus on the frontal lobe when 0 to 10 years, or when the neurotransmitters are making connections? Seems like 0 to 10 is more critical.
Right. Well, I guess it's really that's a very, very, very good point. And childhood and adolescence are obviously both critical. They both make the foundation for your adulthood. But there are, I think, because with childhood, what you need is a healthy brain. You need a healthy, safe, not overly stressful environment where there's proper nutrition, etc. And the frontal lobes will do what they need to do there. During adolescence, the molding of the frontal lobes is an active process. They won't mold themselves to help you fit into the culture without being part of the culture. They won't just develop in a healthy way if you stay at home with your parents. It's an active thing. So it's more dynamic, and I think in that way it's more complex and requires more of our attention to what are we letting into our teens' frontal lobes and what are we letting them learn, how are they being reinforced. It's just far more complicated than the way the frontal lobes develop during childhood. Clearly, unhealthy childhood, not a healthy foundation for adolescence, which is going to make it less likely you end up leaving adolescence a healthy adult.
Okay.
Good point.
You say teens might be more sensitive to reward than adults. What supports this thought?
Well, I like to use words like might when there is science to support something, but not enough science that I'm willing to say with certainty it does. So this is one example. There was a study, very good study, but one study a few years ago, and I showed the slide from it. But basically, what the study did is they looked at children, adolescents, and adults. They put them in a neuroimaging device, apparatus, and they monitor activity in the reward area. Then they had children, adolescents, and adults do a task where they were given a money reward. So they're basically, whether you actually give a teenager the money or you just tell them they're going to get the money soon, the reward areas light up more than in children and adults, which suggests that the reward areas are more sensitive in adolescents than children or adults.
Okay, thank you. 2 more questions. The frontal lobe is smaller for teens that use. What do you know about recovery of frontal lobe size, hours, days, ever? What have you seen? Any research on this?
I'm trying to think if there have actually been any studies yet looking at recovery of frontal lobe volume, the structure of the frontal lobes when teens stay sober. And I don't think there have been. I could be missing something, big, but I don't think I am. What has been done is researchers have looked at how well teens do when they're in treatment for alcohol abuse, for instance, relative to non-alcohol abusing teens, how they do on tasks that you need the frontal lobes for. And they're impaired. But then if they come out of treatment and they stay sober, over the next several years, those frontal lobe abilities start to look like the abilities of healthy controls. Teens who come out of treatment and go back to abusing alcohol, their abilities to do these frontal lobe mediated tasks stays poor. So I think based upon functioning of the brain, there's a good chance the frontal lobes heal, probably to a large extent, over time if a teen stays sober. But like I mentioned, they're not going back to the same brain they would have had without the substances because the brain is developing. The drugs are going to kick it into a different line of development. And so you might end up with a healthy brain again, but it's going to be different in some way than it would have otherwise. We don't know exactly what means yet.
Okay. Last question, I think. Is there more? Barb, more questions or no? Okay. What exactly happens in the brain to cause a blackout?
Okay. The hippocampus, which is located, you got one on each side of your head. If you point at your temples, you're about at where the hippocampus is. And if you drink alcohol fast enough, and it hits the hippocampus fast enough, it blocks a particular type of receptor in the hippocampus that is very important for learning. So a neurotransmitter trickles out from one neuron and plugs into receptors on another. If the transmitter can't plug into the receptor, it can't cause the effect it was supposed to cause. And in this case, it's involved, the neurotransmitter, it's called NMDA, it's glutamate, floats over, binds to a receptor for something called NMDA. It's the NMDA receptor. Alcohol blocks that. And by blocking that, it prevents the ability of those circuits to make new memories. So while you're in a blackout, you can remember stuff that happened years ago. You can keep stuff going in short term and talk about what happened, what's happening right now. But what you can't do is transfer that information into long-term storage because alcohol is blocking those NMDA receptors. So you end up with a hole. You can pretty much do anything. Anything you could do while you were drunk and not blacked out, you can do while you're drunk and blacked out. You just won't remember it because you can't transfer it to long-term storage.
Okay. Actually, there are two more questions. Are there any differences in brain development between males and females?
Oh, yes. There are way too many to list here, and that's still an ongoing area of study. But the brains of males and females are very different. And just like the bodies of males and females aren't too different on the surface when we're children. I mean, obviously, we have anatomical differences. But it's not until puberty that we really start to separate into very different types of human. The same is true with the brains. When puberty gets kicked off in the late single digits, the male brain goes down one pathway that is different in some ways from the female brain. One example I'll just give you is there's a bundle of nerves that connects the two halves of the brain. So the two halves of the brain can communicate with each other. Well, in females, that bundle gets bigger and matures on a different course because females seem to be better than males at integrating information from the two sides of the brain. So, very different. And we also know what that implications are for, say, the effects of drugs long term or treatment. Still an ongoing area of research.
Okay. Last question. Can you repeat the age you feel that the brain is fully developed?
Sure. It's very, very hard to know, for sure. But I would say early 20s, somewhere 20, 21, 22, that it's largely done, that effects are still trickling, things are still changing, but it's hard to know when it's finished. But mid-20s is actually the most commonly used threshold cutoff based on some early research on adolescent brain development. 25 is the safest number. If I had to pick a number, I'd say 25. It's pretty much done. But I would say most of it is really done very early 20s, yeah.
Okay. I wanted to check and see if we have any more questions. If not, Dr. White, I'd like to thank you very much. This is a really informative and interesting presentation, and it's taken us a while to get here, but we've done it, and we want to very much appreciate you for your time. So,
thanks. Jennifer, can I add a comment?
I'm sorry. What was that?
I add a comment. One last point.
Yes, thank you. Couldn't. Go ahead.
Oh, I should have told the audience that the declines in drinking for young males are much bigger than the declines for young females. In fact, females aren't really declining that much. And so I think it's important to recognize that it is mostly young males that have declined in drinking, not so much young females. So, we have to be aware of that.
That's a really important point. Thanks for adding that. Again, please give a round of applause virtually here. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Run back up. Need to clone myself. All right. I just wanted to give you a few more things before you left tonight. Some of you have been around us for a while. You know that the Community Alliance for Youth Success takes a two-pronged approach to our prevention efforts. One is things like tonight, just providing information, letting you make your decisions about this, not telling you what to do. Make your own decisions, have your conversations with your kids. That's really what we want, is to initiate conversation. The second thing is that our community has embraced the concept of developmental assets. And these are just assets that there's 40 of them. I know we talked about it before, so I won't go into too much detail. You each received a copy of the assets list, the description tonight. And really, it's these features that if you instill these in your kids, the more they have, the better decisions they're going to make, the less likely they are to make decisions that will negatively impact their lives for the long term, and better hope for success as successful adults giving back to their communities. And that's all we really hope to do. So that's the second thing that we do as a group. Let's see what it is. Lastly, this is our second town hall we've had this year, and I think they've been pretty good so far. Really meaningful. But the next one is March 25th, and I've talked to a few people about this, and they've said, to tell you really hit the mark. I talked to a lot of parents, and myself included, about the fact that I'm not sure how to protect my kids when they have a cell phone. Well, all the apps, the social media, all those kinds of things. Everything's always changing. And privacy is something that's become a little hard to come by. So we've made arrangements to get a gentleman from the FBI to come here on March 25th, right here in this room, to talk about how we can protect our kids. As a parent, I can't keep up. I have my kids fix my phone. You know, and we want them to help us do this. And they have some really great materials. So that's March 25th. I don't have a time yet, but it will be here. So please stay tuned to drugfreemidland.org. That is where we'll post information. And the most important thing I forgot about. Hopefully you've seen this. So yeah, just stay tuned to that. We just couldn't get the information out quick enough on that. But I wanted to call your attention to Youth Connections magazine. Hopefully many of you have seen this because it's been mailed to your homes. You've seen it? Is that what you're waving at? Why are you waving at me, Barb?
I wanted to have a show of hands.
Oh, okay. Show of hands. How many of you have gotten this in the mail? Okay, we're missing some of you. Okay, this is mailed